But the reality is that the oldest known fossil at the moment still comes from Laguna de Honco. Beautifully preserved fossils here with flowers, with buds, with beautiful leaves. And for all intents and purposes, it looks like a fragment of Gondwana might have rafted off Antarctica during the breakup of the southern world around 40 odd million years ago, rafted across the Pacific, met up with something like New Britain off the coast of New Guinea, established itself in a situation that was familiar to it in Patagonia, which is the volcanic uplifts and the ash beds of the newly arising volcanoes of Papua New Guinea and its offshore remnants. Established there, started interacting with the rainforest, and as Australia began to dry out and increasingly became an arid continent, the eucalypts jumped into Australia and then just went wild. They hyper-diversified because of the incredible range of habitats and opportunities which were made available by the contraction of the rainforest. So, in essence, the history of the Australian flora is one really of contraction and expansion dynamics. The rainforest, the original rainforest, contracting and expanding, but definitely over time contracting to the point now where less than 1% of the land mass is now rainforest. And in that process, of course, some of the other flora, like the eucalypts, were able to jump onto the continent and diversify and dominate. So they're the sort of dynamics that have driven the continent. And essentially the rainforest, of course, is now in a minority. Less than 1% of the country is dominated by rainforest. Some of our early research in the rainforest locally were long-term plots, some of them up to 37 to 47 years in duration, plots that were set up so that we could measure the dynamics and interactions of rainforest trees through time. And in the Big Scrub itself, we actually have a few permanent plots, several of which are close to 40 odd years old, and some of them a little younger. And that's my good friend Mina Kariuki, with whom I did some research during his PhD. But we have done a fair bit of work in the Big Scrub area and around the Nightcap, and we've included many of these sites in, this is going to run itself, so many of those sites in our research. So what we're seeing here, which is running by itself for some reason, is the history of the Gondwanan rainforest. So if we look at that, we can see that Antarctica and the Cretaceous to the Paleocene to Eocene of Antarctica essentially was an early manifestation of Gondwana. Patagonia, we have a fossil record for the Cretaceous some 70 million years ago. But New Zealand and Australia, our fossil records, unfortunately, are relatively poor, and they don't show up until the Paleocene and Eocene. But Patagonia starts off looking a fair bit like Antarctica. Makes sense. It was close offshore to Antarctica, and so therefore wasn't far away. The Paleocene, Eocene of Patagonia and the Cretaceous, as you can see, the two dots are closer together. That means that they're more similar. So basically, over those are around 20 million years, not much changed, basically. And so what we see is that Antarctica basically shifts from the Cretaceous to the Paleocene, and then the whole flora goes extinct. There's a massive ice age. Australia now starts to show us that in the Paleocene to Eocene, and then into the Neogene, which is 22 or 20, around 25 million years ago, there's very little shift. So what that tells us is, a little bit like Patagonia, Australia in those early times in the fossil record, the vegetation stays fairly stable. It doesn't move very much. So I'm just waiting for this to catch up to us. New Zealand, though, as you can see, starts off in the Paleogene to Eocene and shifts an enormous distance. So basically what's happening there is that it's losing one flora and picking up a whole new flora as it comes into contact with Antarctica and the austral vegetation, the Australian vegetation. Meanwhile, Patagonia is starting to run along a line of extinction. So it's beginning to lose its paleoflora, and because of the Ice Age and because of Antarctica having this massive ice sheet developing, Patagonia is losing its vegetation. New Zealand by this time has sunk under the water and has re-emerged, and so it's now inheriting the flora of modern day Australia, or close to modern day Australia. So what we see here is a 70 million year timeline, and in a moment Australia will reappear. There it is. And what you see from that is modern day Australia isn't that different in terms of the rainforest Gondwanan element from the Paleocene to the Neogene. What that tells us is that only in Australia has the true Gondwanan diversity survived. Even though southern Patagonia is full of Antarctic beech and so-called Nothofagus type forests, in New Zealand we have agathis, we have the Antarctic beech again, Nothofagus. We have a whole range of Dacrycarpus and Dacrydiums, all these key indicators of the Gondwanan flora. The reality is that for the period of time that we're looking at, from 70 million years to the present, it's only Australia that's actually survived with that Gondwanan element as close as it was to the original. The consequence of that, of course, is that when we dig up fossils in Patagonia that are 52 million years old, they resemble the living Australian flora. That's that 70 million year history in a nutshell. So that's a piece of research that we did with, as you can see there, with some of Australia's and Argentina's and North America's foremost paleobotanists, and we ended up with this, which is essentially an overview that includes, this time near Australia, Fiji, Mount Kinabalu, New Caledonia and Papua New Guinea. They're included in this because as Australia dried even more and we lost even more of our Gondwanan flora, in desperation, just as we were about to lose those Gondwanan elements, we slammed into the Papua Asia, the Sunda. We had a huge uplift in Papua New Guinea, and species like Dacrycarpus, Dacrydium, Papua cedrus, a whole range of these ancient Gondwanan conifers jumped from North Queensland into Papua and survived on the cool mountaintops, including across to Sabah. So this is a remarkable slow motion escape of climate change. This whole flora has slowly but surely drifted on the Australian continent. Elsewhere it's been filtered down and sifted down to a point where it's hyper simplified. Tasmania, southern Patagonia, places like that now where we see a very limited expression of that flora. But in central subtropical Australia and in far north Queensland, we see an amazing expression of that original Gondwanan flora, and we see it extend up into Asia, all as a consequence of the fact that Australia rafted in slow motion from Antarctica and just escaped this certain death by just moving a few centimetres a year to finally collide with the Sunda plate. So, what does that have to do with the big scrub? Well, obviously the big scrub contains many of those Gondwanan elements, but it's also got many other elements mixed in with it. So this is what we've been doing for some time, is looking at the various elements, and this is on the border ranges, that image with Nothofagus on the left and the subtropical Buyong-dominated forests on the right. So in the border ranges just around us here, we have strong indications of the cool adapted Gondwanan component of the flora. We also have the wonderful mix of the subtropical elements that escaped the ice ages in our local forests, the Buyong elements. But mixed in with that Buyong element, we also have the Indo-Malaysian, the Sunda invaders from Malaysia and Indonesia that have come into Australia subsequently. So the big scrub area, of course, includes elements of the Gondwanan flora and elements of the Indo-Malaysian flora. So that's what gives it some of its remarkable diversity, but it also, of course, gives us as research scientists an incredible window of opportunity to look into both deep time and current day competence in terms of how plants make a living, who they live with, and what was that like compared to what it was in the past. So when we look just briefly here, if you look at the continental rainfall, we know that rainforest is very limited in distribution in Australia. It's tied to predominantly moisture gradients. This is a very, very dry continent. The major filtering process that's gone on this continent is the loss of habitat suitable for rainforest. But still, we have incredible diversity retained in our flora. And if you can read some of those, you'll just get a brief glimpse of something over 2,000 woody species, trees, shrubs and vines that still live on the Australian continent in the rainforests. And you also get a hint of the patchy distribution of the rainforest in the current day. So when we look at that more closely, of course, within those patches, and across that latitudinal gradient and the gradient of temperature and moisture from the Kimberley right through to Tasmania, we start to see some patterns. And there's been some very nice research done on the implications of seed size and fruit size. Louis Weber here with us has done some lovely work on the spread of endemism related to seed size, and similarly we've done work on fruit size and seed size, its distribution, and of course seed size regulates dispersal. If you have a very big seed, if you're a tree with a very big seed, there's a limited number of things that can move you around the landscape. So as a consequence of that, what we see in simple terms is that areas that have been heavily disturbed, where the local seed dispersers have been reduced in number and type, we end up with only a subset of dispersal vectors. And the birds that can eat, say, Elaeocarpus grandis, the blue fig, are around the maximum in many areas. But in pockets of Australia, particularly the subtropics here in northern New South Wales and southeast Queensland and up in far north Queensland, there are fruits that are very much, and seeds that are very much larger than any of our volant birds can move around. So in far north Queensland, of course, there's the persistence of the cassowary. So we still have a large animal that can ingest and move very, very large seeds and fruits around the landscape. In northern New South Wales, our last cassowary died out during the last major interglacials. So southeast Queensland, northern New South Wales, there are a few fossils for cassowary, the dwarf cassowary apparently, the one that it's related more closely to the dwarf cassowary of Papua New Guinea. And it looks like that there were cassowaries ultimately moving large fruits around up until 20,000 years ago, maybe a bit more, and subsequently we've lost them. We've lost them, of course, because the natural contraction of the subtropical rainforest has been quite extreme, and it's been more extreme than it has been in far north Queensland, where the cassowary survives, and in Papua New Guinea. Remembering, of course, that when I show Australia like this is the political Australia. The real Australia has Papua attached to it. Papua New Guinea, the whole New Guinean highlands are Australia. They're austral. They're part of the Australian landmass, more or less, and that uplifted highland area, although now part of Malaysia and Indonesia politically, it is essentially part of Australia. So if you look at the bird life in Papua, you'll see remarkable similarities, just more diversity. And of course the same with much of the flora, except there's a little more influence from the Indo-Malaysian elements, as you'd expect. So that incredible history of interaction of these floras is part also of the history of the big scrub. So this is just a quicker synopsis, if you like, a percentage of fleshy fruits. The take-home message from this is in the little box that large fruited species have smaller ranges. In other words, they're distributed. They're not distributed as far. and are associated with stable, moist refuges. In other words, places that have not expanded and contracted, have not lost the rainforest at some time, but have been relatively stably dominated by rainforest. In those cases, we have both higher genetic diversity and higher endemism in the flora. And of course, that large fruits in the reverse are rare in areas that have contracted and then been recolonised and re-expanded. So as a consequence of that, of course, fruit size gives us an insight into the distribution of the core rainforest refuges in Australia, those areas that have survived over tens of millions of years. And they give us really neat insights into, when we do the genetic work, into the sort of genetics that the Sunda, that is the Indo-Malaysian flora, has versus the Sahul, which is the Gondwanan flora. So more recently, we've been able to use genomic research, which is a new emerging aspect of genetic and ecological research. It allows us to look at the whole of the genome of species, and we've done this now for more than 70 rainforest species locally in the Big Scrub, as well as a larger number from North Queensland. And we've managed to find distinct genetic patterns. And one of those patterns is that the Sahul, the Gondwanan element of our flora, has more genetic diversity and it's more structured spatially. So what that means is that because the once extant, once widely distributed Gondwanan component of the flora got reduced and reduced and reduced down to little isolated pockets, within each of those pockets was in the original Gondwanan diversity, genetic diversity as well, but because of isolation, it was further partitioned and drifted and differed slightly. So when we look at the landscape signals from the Gondwanan flora in terms of genetics, we get, first of all, there's more diversity, and secondly, there's more diversity that's structured relative to each of the locations and the differences between northern New South Wales and far north Queensland. So that's of great interest to us, of course, because from that we can discern more clearly the history of the contraction-expansion phases, and we can understand how plants survive major climate changes. In terms of the Sunda species, the Indo-Malaysian species, what we get from them is a signal of very little diversity across their geographic distribution in Australia. In other words, from far north Queensland all the way down to northern New South Wales. Many of those taxa have very little difference in terms of their genetic signature. And they also have certain attributes which make perfect sense when you think about it. They've got small seeds that are highly dispersible, and they move around the landscape fairly quickly. They grow fairly quickly, they establish fairly quickly, and their reproductive population dynamics is also quicker than the Gondwanan species. All of which makes sense when we're thinking about an invasive Sunda Indo-Malaysian element mixing in with an expanding and contracting Gondwanan element. So it's during those expansion-contraction dynamic phases that the Indo-Malaysian flora has been able to first get into the country, and then during that time take advantage of opportunities when the Gondwanan flora was contracting and then re-expanding. So that mixture that we see in the Big Scrub is a consequence of all those millions of years of interaction, of expansion-contraction dynamics, and the mixing of the Sunda Indo-Malaysian with the Sahul Gondwanan floras. So that's a remarkable history. I mean, just get your head around that. You know, when you go walking in these local rainforests and you see trees, some of them are Sunda, some of them are Sahul, they're interacting and have done for millions of years, and the consequence and the basis for that interaction are the dynamics of biogeography and climate through millions of years. It's an extraordinary thing. And that's what we're looking at with the tools that we have available to us now in ecology and evolutionary biology. We're able to unravel these stories, to actually put numbers on them, remembering that as an ecologist, when we do ecology, it's mathematics. Okay, so it's not descriptive. It's not just natural history. We do a lot of mathematics. So what we get from the genetic signals, of course, are numbers that we can analyse, and we can put those against seed size and distributions, and we can start to unravel some of that history and some of the secrets that these are really hidden away in these rainforests. So every species that we look at has part of this story embedded in it, in its genetic codes, in its evolutionary strategies, in its persistence, but also in terms of its traits, its leaf sizes, its leaf teeth, its leaf venation, the leaf vein densities, the seed sizes, the fruit sizes, the rewards that are on the fruits. All of these things interact to have allowed these lineages to both persist and operate in the landscapes today. So when we start looking locally, we bring that big whole story down to a local level, and we look at the nightcap border ranges versus the washpool and Dorrigo. We get some pretty interesting signals, and these three areas are ideal candidates for study, simply because the Clarence River corridor is a dry corridor that separates Dorrigo from the border ranges nightcap area and the big scrub. And the washpool, of course, is a little outlier to the west. So if we look at that, just tap once more, yep, and again, if we look at that, we can see basically that the Clarence River corridor has also, to some extent, filtered the Sunda Sahul components. So below the Clarence River corridor, there's a greater or an enhanced diversity, genetic diversity of the Sahul Gondwanan component. North of the Clarence River corridor, in the nightcap border ranges where we are here, we get more influence from the Indo-Malaysian element. So the Clarence River corridor has acted as a barrier to the more recent expansion of the Indo-Malaysian element into these southern forests, these subtropical forests. We asked ourselves, could we find that signal within these three study sites? And so we've done genomic work, genetic work plus trait work across all of those boundaries, and essentially, again, what we get is that basically what we found out is that the nightcap border ranges has more diversity in the Sunda Indo-Malaysian element than Dorrigo. Dorrigo retains more of the Sahul genetic diversity, but fewer species. So this area actually has a little more of the Indo-Malaysian element, but a lot more species from the Gondwanan history. But Dorrigo has more genetic diversity within the Gondwanan component. So this area and Dorrigo become two of the most important subtropical refuges in Australia, and consequently for Gondwanan flora in the world. Remembering, of course, that extinction is a process, not an event. Extinction is the outcome of population decline and population dynamics. The real harm that you and I, all of us, do to the country, to the land, is that we reduce species population sizes. And by doing that, we reduce their genetic potential, we reduce the potential for adaptation, we reduce the connectivity in the landscape, which robs species of the movement of genes across the landscape. And by so doing, we isolate species and parts and populations of species in small areas of habitat, and that makes them extremely vulnerable to extinction. So that process sometimes takes a very long time, sometimes we've accelerated it quite dramatically. Extinction is a natural process. It's part of the dynamics of landscapes. It's just that what we've done is change the population dynamics of so many species that extinction risk is essentially rises.
15 minutes.
Okay, so what does that mean for the big scrub? I guess that's the really interesting thing. Having walked into a landscape now that's 99% cleared, with much of that evolutionary and current day ecological history and legacy already destroyed, what do we do about that? Well, it's part of the, if we count ourselves as part of the contraction and expansion dynamics of these ecosystems, and we were generous enough to leave room for native vegetation to re-emerge and redominate parts of the landscape, there is some hope, without a doubt. And I think that hope is given expression through our local community, through the fact that so many people dedicate themselves to reinvigorating landscapes like the big scrub that have been degraded, have been largely cleared. And within that capacity to both set aside areas suitable for restoration and regeneration and rehabilitation, and also for people to set aside both resources and energy to try to stimulate those processes in these landscapes. We do need to try to protect those elements, both the evolutionary and the ecological components of that history. But we don't need to go too far in terms of trying to recreate the original. There's a little bit of leeway here, because essentially what we've done is remove 99% of it. So if we set ourselves a target of trying to restore it in exactly the way it was originally, over whatever extent, that's going to be a difficult task. So what we need, of course, is to recreate the potential for natural processes to kickstart in the landscape. We need to be creative about the way we plant species. We need to be wary of not contaminating, if you like, the genetic pool with lineages from outside that might corrupt the process. But equally, having said that, we need to be very careful about the fact that we're already dominated by cinnamomum, camphora, the camphor laurel. There's a tree that's taken up an Indo-Malaysian invader that's taken up the opportunity of contraction and has re-expanded the forest. So what we're faced with, of course, are some really interesting challenges. And these are challenges that I know over the decades that have been the subject of many of the discussions at the Big Scrub Days. Some wonderful debates and interactions around how we treat some of these invading woody species, and what the dynamics of the landscape might look like through time in terms of both protecting those wonderful evolutionary and current day ecological legacies, as well as taking advantage of some of what's going on in that landscape. So those challenges remain. We haven't got clear answers, but we've certainly got some inkling about where it might all go. So I have a few people to thank, and I'll do that. And I think that'll do for me. Thank you.
So speak clearly and loudly, please.
Okay, two very short questions. The first one is, are you going to put those slides online on the weekend?
I could. Yes,
I would really appreciate it.
Yeah. Yep. Okay.
That's the first one. The other one is a more philosophical one, about when regenerating. What role do you think it can play in being a latter-day category? In terms of putting more big seeds, big fruit stuff.
Yep. Everybody hear that question? Okay, so it's a very good question, because the answer is that it does fall to us to move the big seeds around. It is our responsibility at this point, having cleared the source populations of the large fruited taxa, that it's now up to us to plant those species that have the big seeds and fruits around the landscape, staying true to, more or less, to the local provenance, if that's a term that we want to use. Remembering, of course, that includes pretty much all of the north of New South Wales. Don't get too fussed about that. And particularly for the large fruits, I think there's a major role for people in restoration to add those to the mix. But equally, of course, when you come to restoring forests, and many of you have done it, you'll know that the big scrub type, there's two major types: black bean, red bean, and bouillon, white bouillon, a gyrodendron. A gyrodendron is actually hard to grow, slow to grow, and very rarely in a restoration will it become a dominant canopy species within decades. So essentially what we have to do, and that's what I was talking about, using what we understand of the flora and the way the species interact. We plant bouillon, but we do it as an understory. It prefers a little bit of shade or a very small gap, and they will grow, and they'll grow well, but they won't grow as well as something like a Flinders schottiana or a number of other, like a bumpy ash or a cudgely. They won't grow as quickly as those, and so we use those species to draw up and shade the forest somewhat and have these slower growing species come up through it, and those big fruited species. Yeah.
Apart from the last couple of hundred years without technological assaults, can you make a comment on the impact on?
Well, apart from, I mean, really, the impact of Indigenous people, I'm assuming you're...
And trade and prejudice.
Yeah, I think essentially that the impact is low, other than fire. And fire, of course, is variously attributed to Indigenous people and their use of fire. The time that Indigenous people have been evident on the Australian continent, which is a long time, and it includes several major climatic oscillations, they have, like all humans, taken advantage of climatic variation and have burned when it was possible and when it suited them in terms of the fauna that they were hunting and the flora that they used. But equally, they protected many areas of forest that were of importance to them, the so-called increased sites and the important rainforest areas. So it's impossible to do any more than provide a little conjecture about Indigenous models of rainforest management, but certainly in terms of sclerophyll forest, fire-prone vegetation, that has been to some extent modified and manipulated, but the full extent of that is unknown. But just remember that over 50,000 years, if you take the minimum estimates for Indigenous population size and you multiply that by generational times, over 1 billion Aboriginal pairs of feet have walked this continent. All right? So it's not, just do the mathematics and you will understand that even though Aboriginal people were in low numbers relative to our burgeoning population, that the reality is that time scale is unprecedented in our terms. We're talking about hundreds of years. With them, we're talking about 50,000. You do the generational mathematics, you end up with a lot of footprints across this continent. So the answer is an open question, and it's a good one. Yes.
I did a number of calculations. Maurizio was my co-supervisor.
Oh, cool.
And I did a number of calculations on the side that I wasn't expecting to do, looking at conservation genetics. And I was a bit unhappy about what I found, which is that with, let's just say, a minimum of 290 tree or shrub species that are endemic to the big scrub rainforest, if that's been retracted to roughly 556 hectares, and then you assume that that was mature canopy and that they're not 1.5 metre spacings like in northern New South Wales tree planting, it's going to be more open than that. It's very unlikely that most of those species maintain sufficient effective population sizes to have evolutionary adaptability for regular conditions, let alone a rapidly changing climatic scenario like this one. And so I looked at that and I thought, well, that's very alarming, because a lot of species, we don't know which ones they are because we've done very little chloroplast work, very little microsatellite work, because it's not, a lot of these species haven't been touched yet. And I was thinking about it, and all these ideas of local provenance that I'd heard in bush regeneration. Oh, it's got to be from this catchment or that catchment. And then, so that's what you hear, I've heard amongst the scene, and now I have no idea what anyone thinks. Because when I've been to the nurseries, they've said the big scrub is a local provenance. This whole big 75,000 hectares, or a bit bigger than that, or I'm not interested in that at all. And the reason I bring this up is because it is a question, by the way.
I was going to ask you that.
Yeah, the reason I bring this up is, how do you feel about discussing including a greater area into our provenance picture so that we can increase the diversity, because we're going to face a novel climate scenario?
I think the short answer is that we do need to source our material from a larger area. If we think about the big scrub, it was never in isolation. It was always connected to the nightcap and the western forest. It was always connected through to the coast and up along the coast, up onto the Tweed. So basically, except for the very large fruited taxa that are endemic nearby, they will have unique genetic material, and they are also already pre-adapted to major contraction. The other species that we use in the big scrub, really it is open to expanding the area of seed collection, and in some ways it may be an important addition to secure a future for many of these species, because that genetic implosion, if you like, that loss of diversity through time that comes from small populations is the precursor to extinction. So we know that, but we also know that the Australian flora, the rainforest flora, is uniquely adapted to expansion and contraction. So the shedding of harmful alleles is also embedded in that history. So is this flora hypersensitive to that? Probably not. But should we take account of it? Absolutely. Absolutely. And their discussions that Maurizio's larger project and my own with the Royal Botanic Gardens, looking at the restore and the renew process, that's all about defining this for restoration right across New South Wales. Yes.
Just following from that, if the 1% that's left, but it's scattered, so would you expect greater diversity in the 1%?
No, not really. Not really. Do it with that 1% that's left? Do we expect to find high diversity within that 1% of the big scrub that's left within the species?
Because it's scattered.
Because it's scattered. And the answer to that, to some extent, theory would suggest that because small populations are widely scattered and not interacting, there's no pollen flow and there's no seed movement between them, we end up with genetic drift, and we get unique genetic signals between small populations. To some extent that's true in bigger landscapes where there's bigger populations. In the big scrub, it's a consequence of a couple of hundred years, less than that actually, it's 120 odd years of clearing, and the consequence is that we've lost more than that. Obviously we would have lost more than what's been retained. So we do need to be very aware of the risks, but equally it's, we need to just define some rules for seed collection, and they'll be allowing a slightly broader landscape to collect from.
So what